Hello everybody and welcome back to Check Yeah. My name is Garrett and today we're going to talk a little bit about Linux.
What's Linux?
Well, Linux is part of an operating system.
What?
If you've been in the industry for a while, you probably are pretty familiar with what Linux is. It runs in our smartphones, it runs in our tablets, it runs in some smart fridges, it runs in some toilets. It is literally everywhere. And you probably have encountered it without knowing. But if you're new to the industry, some of this might sound a little foreign to you, and that's okay, don't worry. I'm here for you. We're gonna get through this. So go ahead, grab your caffeinated beverage of choice. I'm going with Red Bull today, and let's go ahead and get into it. A kernel, for simplicity's sake, is a core part of an operating system. A lot of people, when they talk about or think about Linux, especially if you're new or you're not inclined, you might actually think that Linux is actually the part that is the operating system, and that assumption actually would be wrong. Linux, the kernel, is the core part of the operating system, and let me explain a little bit about what that means. Okay, now, a kernel...
Kernel like popcorn?
No, not like popcorn.
Oh, what is it, smart guy?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. A kernel, for simplicity's sake, is a core part of the operating system. It acts as a bridge between your applications and the data processing that's happening at the hardware level. Now, Linux was actually started as a project in 1991 by a Finnish software engineer named Linus Torvalds. Linus Torvalds wanted to make a freely distributable operating system that could run the Unix software that he was already running, but he also wanted to access some of the newer functions of the Intel 8386 processor, which a lot of you might recognize the name of, or if you're not familiar, was one of the very most pivotal processors introduced by Intel. It was one of the very first things that kind of gave their whole company a lot of momentum. It ended up turning into the Pentium, right? This is the start of the Intel Pentium and the x86 that we know today.
This symbol outside means you have the standard inside that an entire library of software has been written to. The Intel microprocessor. Think of it as a library card that lets you run the software of today and tomorrow. So check out Computers with Intel, the computer inside.
Now, Linux has been in constant development since this point in 1991, since it was first created, and now has a whole team of people that contribute code to the actual kernel. And now the kernel itself consists of over 23 million lines of code. That is just a mind-boggling number. To try to wrap your head around that, that also loads in less than 30 seconds on just about any device with modern storage, of course. That's how many millions of lines. That's just for the kernel, right? That's just for communicating with your hardware. Could you imagine? This is why. It's not that humans are obsolete, it's just like we can't do that many millions of things at once. Not voluntarily, anyhow. Now, a lot of people are probably scratching your head about this point. They're like, but I thought Linux was an operating system, and like it kind of is, but it's more of like part of one, and this is just super confusing. It doesn't really add to like the understanding, right? So when you take the Linux kernel and you bundle it with other packages and certain things for handling different functions and different softwares, we call that a distribution. Now, this is what you've probably heard of. Somebody might say, well, I installed Ubuntu on my laptop, or my server's running Arch Linux, or I really like running Steam on Manjaro. It's a little confusing to set up, but overall, I just think it's better. You will hear comments like this quite frequently, and that's what they're referring to, a distribution. Now, when it comes to active Linux distributions, there are over 600. I will reference probably Debian quite frequently. The reasons for that being is Debian is one of the more well-known. It's made by an organization, so there's a team of people that care about it and care about the code base, and it's been around for a very long time. And once you look at the tree that makes up these 600 distributions, Debian is quite closer to the bottom of the tree, quite closer to the original, Linux. It's been in development a lot longer. And it's a lot more straightforward, but a lot of other people have their own choices, and there's a flavor, literally a flavor out there for everybody. So once you take the kernel and you take it and you add it to one of these distributions, this is what a normal person would recognize as an operating system. So if you put them in front of like an Ubuntu Linux, per se, they might recognize that something's up just because the UI is way different than what they're used to with Linux. I'll get you some shots here. It's just the Linux UI, especially if you install the bog standard graphical desktop environment, what they're going to load into and be looking at is completely different from what they're used to on Windows. But if you took one of them and sat them down at something like Linux Mint, chances are they're going to be really, really comfortable with where they're at. And that's just because there's a lot of similarities between the graphical user interface between Linux Mint and Windows. We can draw a lot of these parallels. So if it sounds confusing, it's really not that confusing. If you're looking to get into Linux, this is generally the area where you're going to start. There's not a lot of real need to do a lot of kernel swapping and stuff like that. There can be in the future if you're trying to run a particular bit of software. There might be a need for you to modify or recompile your kernel. These are all very big words that I'm throwing out, but for the general user, you're not going to have to deal with any of that. So generally, when you put it into a distribution, especially if you pick any of the well-known ones, Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, any of these more well-known Linux distributions, they're going to feel like any other computing platform. Well, for starters, Linux is free, so obtaining it and getting started and learning the processes is really simple. So there's a plethora of resources available to get you started, and there are tutorials galore to keep you busy for days learning Linux. Also, it's worth noting that about 67% of the entire internet as a whole runs on Linux. So if you want to get into web development, you're going to run into Linux at some point in time, sooner or later. Even though other back-end technologies are getting more popular, it's still a good chance that you're going to run into Linux. Also, if we take our search a little further and we take Google search and we search what percent of the corporate world runs on Linux, we get a even more mind-boggling number, which is 96.3%. So that means out of all the servers out there in the corporate world running things like databases and things like that, we got an overwhelmingly 96.3% runs on Linux. So if you plan on getting into any of these realms in IT, learning a little bit of Linux is going to go a long way. Now, I've already alluded to the fact that it's free, so that's probably a good reason why there's a lot of companies out there that are using Linux, and that's just because the barrier to entry for them is very, very low. Also, because of this, there have been several packages made over the years to make it a lot more convenient to set up a Linux installation than it used to be, say 10 years ago or so. And with one command or two, or usually just one, it just depends on how you word your syntax, but with a few commands you can be up and running. You got a web server, a database server, a Minecraft server. There's so many different server technologies that all they take is one or two commands and you're off to the races. So now you've listened to me talk a little bit about Linux and you're like, okay, I really want to give this thing a try. What do I do? Well, now comes the most difficult part. You have to actually choose which distribution you're going to learn on. Now, as I've already said previously in the video, there's over 600 active distributions, so there is literally a flavor out there for everybody, and the best thing I can say when you're starting out is to just go with something that has a lot of documentation, something that's been out for a long time. like Fedora or Red Hat or Debian or Ubuntu. Any of these are a good bet because they're going to have really active forums and a lot of tutorials, and there's going to be a lot of documentation out there to help you get through your Linux journey.